All right. Well, I might do my little admin and forward bit, and then I'll hand over to Paul, and hopefully some more people have jumped in. Hi everyone. My name is James Petty. I'm from the Victorian Alcohol and Drug Association. I'm the lead on ADRIA, which is the Alcohol and Drug Research Innovation Agenda, an AOD-focused research grants program. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. I'm in Collingwood, so that's the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, as well as acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, waters and culture. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So just a few admin bits and bobs. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function down on the bottom of your screen. The chat will be monitored, but that's more for tech issues. So yeah, if you have a question, please pop it through the Q&A function. The presentation will be recorded and made available on the ADRIA web page, and the slide pack will also be made available on request. So if you'd like that, please email me after the webinar. ADRIA is about to launch its third grant round. So EOIs will be opening on the 15th of September and will be open until the 3rd of November. The updated program guidelines have been emailed to those on the ADRIA mailing list and will be available on the ADRIA webpage shortly. The ADRIA webpage is currently being updated, so it will be going this week, but it's just not going at this very moment. So today's webinar is about establishing project partnerships. Dr. Paul Kellner is joining us again today. He delivered some webinars for us previously in relation to ADRIA, so on grant writing and on sort of conducting quick literature reviews. We're going to do those webinars again in the next few months, so keep an eye out for those. And I've seen Paul's slides and I know he's going to introduce himself, so I'll just hand straight over now. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, James. And I will share my screen. Just one moment. Let's see here. All right. Yeah, so great to be speaking with all of you today. As James said, I'll be speaking about establishing research partnerships. And I guess it's phrased this way. I want to just clarify one thing up front, that although I'll speak primarily from a university researcher's perspective, we should also include in this sort of thinking and conversation think tanks and other knowledge sector organizations. So much of this will be from the university perspective, but there are others who do research who aren't necessarily academics as well. So feel free to think about those things, those organizations as well. And I just want to acknowledge at the outset that a colleague of mine also helped bounce some of these ideas. And his name is Kong Lem Go. And so I just want to say publicly thank you to Kong for helping with developing some of these slides. And thanks to Vada for having me back. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you all and hearing some of your thoughts when we have a few question and answer sessions. First, a quick overview of what I'd like to speak with you about today. It's really pretty basic stuff. I first want to talk to you about why we should build research partnerships, or why we'd want to in the first place. Second, ways to identify a partner, and that includes sort of how to go about finding a partner, but also maybe some characteristics that you might want to think about in partners, as well as the practicalities of cold emailing or contacting somebody who you haven't spoken with before. Third is really the core of the presentation, which is just things to consider when you're maybe thinking about working with a university-based researcher. So just things to know about how university-based researchers function that might affect the way that you structure a relationship or what you need to communicate. Next is some useful partnership principles and practices. And these are things that probably should go without saying, but I really find important to just affirm whenever new partnerships are being built. And then lastly, I'll offer a few models of partnership, just as a suggestion of ways of thinking about how you could structure relationships in different ways. And then we'll have time for question and answer, I'm sure, as well. Also, I'll just mention that throughout the presentation, I'll have a couple of sort of waypoints where I'll ask you to do some either group reflection or individual reflection. And so this is a pretty relaxed discussion, and so feel free to engage with those questions, but also if at those stopping points you have questions or clarifications, feel free to share those as well. So I'm going to pursue that agenda because I have a few very modest goals for today. I'd love for you to end this webinar with a couple of things. First, some ideas about why and how you might want to build a research partnership. So just that really reason of why you do it in the first place. Next is some ideas about how you might jumpstart the process. So whether it's reaching out by cold email or whether you're going to reach into your personal networks, just how you might actually get started. Some ideas about how to structure the partnership. So both considering what you bring to a relationship, what a university researcher might bring to the relationship, and how you'd actually build it. And then lastly, maybe most importantly, a bit of inspiration or motivation or confidence or just something that you might not have had prior to the webinar, just additional motivation to possibly build a partnership. So the last thing I should clarify is who I am. So I'm Paul Kellner. I'm currently a research fellow at the Monash Sustainable Development Evidence Review Service, and I'll talk a little bit about that service in a moment. But most relevant to this conversation is probably just that I've worked in a lot of sectors, so government, nonprofits, corporates, universities. I've always been sort of an applied researcher, but in many different contexts. And I've done a fair amount of partnership building, especially between sort of government and NGOs and university sort of tripartite relationships. And I've also just always focused on applied research. So how academic research gets used in day-to-day purposes. It has mostly been in international development settings, but I've also done a bit of work here in Australia now over the last 4 years. So the last bit is my organization, the Evidence Review Service at Monash University. And I just want to highlight sort of the different types of things we do to give you a sense of how we function and what a unit like mine does on a day-to-day basis, because it might be interesting for you to know. We almost function a bit like a consultancy. So most of our work is actually driven by contracts with governments or nonprofits or collaborations with other universities. But we undertake rapid evidence reviews. Usually these are desktop reviews, so just quickly using systematic review principles to answer a question that somebody might need answered. So if government needs to know the best quality evidence in a short turnaround time, we do a quick high quality evidence review to help answer their question. And sometimes this is about sort of what's the problem. Sometimes it's about what works to address a problem. We answer sort of a range of types of questions. And alongside that work, we often do qualitative research as well. We do expert interviews quite frequently, probably oftentimes with people like yourselves. So experts in a field of practice who might be able to provide context or insight into what we learn from a desktop review and use those qualitative findings in conjunction with the desktop reviews. And then we also have practices around prioritization and co-design. So we are frequently hired to sort of prioritize research questions that an organization might be thinking about and how to invest their efforts well. And then teaching and training, which includes this sort of activity today. So that's me. On to the actual presentation. The first bit I wanted to talk to you about is why build a research partnership. And there's a lot of good reasons to do so, in my opinion, speaking as a researcher. Probably first and foremost is to help you understand and address a complex issue. So most of the things that I imagine you're dealing with and that we as researchers are dealing with are issues that are bigger than just our skill set alone can address. And so research partnerships are a powerful tool in helping to understand or address a complex issue. Also, very frequently, NGO and research organization partnerships are built to actually develop or test a solution to a challenge being faced. So very frequently an academic will be brought in to evaluate a program that might be running, especially if it's, a program in an area where there isn't a lot of evidence for what works or what doesn't, or if there's a need to do an external evaluation due to funding requirements. Otherwise, just generally, a good reason to build research partnerships is to pool skills, knowledge, and experience. So researchers often have a great depth of knowledge and are able to just take a different perspective than somebody engaged in day-to-day practice might have. And so those two perspectives are really complementary oftentimes. And so by pooling your skills, you often can kind of create relationships that result in outputs that are more than the sum of their parts. Also, these partnerships can be really practical from just making sure that your work is evidence-based. And that goes all the way from sort of grant writing, which we talked about in the webinars last year, and I'll talk about in the webinars later on. So really having some good evidence to support why you might be advocating for a particular program to be funded. But also in your day-to-day work, once you've got a program running, how you might design different components of it based on what's already known, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel or do something that we know already doesn't work. It's good to know the evidence to help design things. One that I think actually comes up somewhat frequently is also in the long term, sometimes building these partnerships can help build credibility in organizations. So having NGO workers occasionally mentioned as an author on scholarly publications can sometimes give real sort of gravitas or credibility in different settings that can be quite valuable. So whether it's taking a policy position, you can then sort of speak from a place where, oh, I've really done in-depth research on this, and I can confidently say that we take this policy position for a particular reason. Or when presenting learning, and many other contexts. So building that credibility is another reason. The next two relate to ethics. So first off, a relationship from a very practical standpoint is access to ethics boards. So universities here in Australia have ethics review committees, and so a partnership can often facilitate getting an ethics review of a program that otherwise you might have to pay for, frankly. And I guess on the softer side of that discussion, there's also a good reason related to ethics in terms of sort of the ethical or moral obligation to share your learning. And so that's something when I've been working in the social sector that I always really struggled with, is that many times I'd be running a program and we'd be learning really interesting things, but we might not necessarily have the right platform to share it across the sector very efficiently. And so research partnerships can really facilitate that knowledge sharing, because researchers' accountabilities are really very much about sharing of knowledge. The last two I'll just mention are establishing rigorous learning processes. So researchers are often really interested in methods and just learning processes. And so having some researchers around can help you sort of think about how you do things better in a continuous way. Often having a researcher around can also provide some reflective space, I guess, for lack of a better term. So the opportunity just to sort of step back and think. And then lastly, increasingly, I'm finding that there are grants that either require that you have a research partner, or it's strongly encouraged to have a research partner. And so this is kind of an emerging trend, I think. So based on those things, I want to take my first sort of moment for a group reflection. And so I'm just going to take a couple of minutes, and I'm keen to see what your responses are to this question. Reflect on the things that I've just mentioned and think about why your specific organization might want to build a research partnership. And it could be one of those things I mentioned, or it could be other motivations. So feel free to just share those in the Q&A section, and I'll highlight a few once they've come in. Oh, and I should mention, actually, while we're still waiting for people to think, is that the group reflections are designed today to provide you with some initial notes about what you might want to do, how and why you might want to approach building a partnership, so that by the end of the webinar, you have a half page of ideas about how to get started on building a research partnership. Oh yes, so we've got a couple of items. So we've got partnering with universities to help develop research tools in the sector. Yeah, that's a great one. So refining ways of doing research in a sector, especially if you can use common indicators or other things that can facilitate across organization learning, is really valuable. And then the other one was assisting building the evidence base for various tools and processes. Yeah, so I imagine your sector, I don't know your sector all that well, but I imagine you're frequently responding to new and emerging issues. There might be a new substance in the community. I think of fentanyl, for instance, in North America, where I'm from. You know, several years back, that just sort of blasted onto the scene, and I'm sure there was huge amounts of work to be done in your communities in North America. And so I imagine you deal with similar things. That's great. Coming up with solutions for complex problems and the ability to share learning and innovation. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I'll touch on a couple of those things later in the conversation. So yeah, thanks for your engagement on this. I'll keep going. But make sure to just jot down the types of things that you think might motivate you to build a partnership, because I think that's a great starting point. So, ways to identify a partner. I'm going to break this into 3 sections. First, it's finding a partner. Second, it's some characteristics that you might want to think about. And then third, it's sort of how to make an approach. So in terms of finding a partner, searching and then cold emailing on the internet, actually, I find to be quite useful a lot of the time in my professional life. People are generally friendly. Academics love talking about what they do, broadly speaking. And so I wanted to do a quick demonstration. Hopefully I work with my tech well. I wanted to show you how you could use Google Scholar to find people. And if you don't already know who you might want to partner with. And so I just, I don't know if this particular topic is relevant to you, but I thought of intervention strategies to prevent fentanyl overdose in Australia is sort of, let's say I'm interested in that. So if we go to Google Scholar and we search for that, you'll see that you'll get a list of publications that are in order of relevance to your question, according to Google. And one of the things you can do is you probably want to look at more recent things, you know, so you want to see who's doing work on this in, say, the last 5 or 10 years. So let's just arbitrarily say 2016 to the present, and we search. And then you can see here that many of these names have a little underline under them. And so maybe these researchers are known to you. I'm not sure. I don't actually know these people necessarily, but and I hope I'm not putting them on blast and showing their publications. But if you click on a person, you'll see where they're from first off. So this person from the Burnett Institute, and then you'll see a long list of publications, and you can just very quickly skim and see what their body of academic research is about. Oftentimes, there'll also be a link to their profile page for the university on this page. And so you can click through and see how they present themselves there. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that sometimes it's useful to sort by year, because usually this is sorted by citation first, which means that their most cited articles are the ones that are at the top. But you might be more interested in what they're currently working on. And so if you organize by year, you can just sort of have a skim and see what they're doing. And so this is a really quick way to kind of get across who might be working on different topics in your field. So just one thought there for searching. There's lots of other ways to do that searching. LinkedIn is the other one that I wanted to highlight today. Is just that as a person who's relatively new to Australia, I perceive LinkedIn to be central to the professional world here. And so searching on LinkedIn is a great way to just identify who's working in a field, but also to see mutual relationships, right? So LinkedIn has the added benefit of sort of scoping whether or not you might already have mutual relationships and therefore have other avenues of sort of introducing yourself or getting connected. Other ways to meet people, conferences are a great place for mixing. So yeah, and I think the thing to say with conferences is definitely don't be shy about trying to connect after somebody gives a presentation that you found interesting or was useful. Either at the conference or afterwards. Just say, I saw your presentation and I thought it was great and I want to talk to you about it. And then lastly, one that I've found very useful as well is personal or organizational networks. So either just putting the word out through colleagues, or thinking about whether or not your organization has had staff who have gone on to further study or work on a university-based project. In my experience of the social sector, there is a bit of turnover and people do go back for further study sometimes. And the benefit of this approach is that people who might have previous experience with your organization or similar organizations probably won't need to be brought up to speed as much about sort of the nature of your work, as well as sort of the values alignment question. So it's pretty likely that somebody who used to work at your organization who then went on to do some study has a sense of shared purpose that you won't really have to explore as much as you might with other partners. So if you're looking around the internet and just trying to identify people who you don't know and haven't met yet, it's also worth reflecting on some characteristics that might be directly relevant to what you are personally planning or thinking about in terms of your project. And so none of these things that I'm listing now are required, but just good things to think about. So first, do they work in your field? And this might mean not necessarily, preventing overdose deaths from fentanyl in Australia, but it might be lots of expertise in preventing overdose deaths from a related type of substance, So they might have methodological skills or related content skills that are really valuable to you, and they just have to get up to speed on the dynamics of one little part of things. Another thing to consider is, are they based in Australia? Are they based abroad? Because there's strengths and weaknesses to each of those things. So having somebody who's based in Australia will really understand the policy context and the operational context very well. But they might be sort of, their worldview might be focused on Australia. And so one of the things that somebody from abroad might bring is new ideas to address a problem that might not have been tried in Australia. So thinking about what you might need, whether it's that deep understanding of context or fresh ideas, because you might want to target some of your searching based on that. Another promising sign is seeing that people have published with colleagues from NGOs or outside of academia. That just shows that they're already oriented to these sorts of partnerships. And similarly, if you see on their university profile that they've worked outside of academia in the past, that's also a pretty good sign that they are interested in doing this sort of applied research. And so, cold emails. I just want to address this because I philosophically, I believe that people are generally very friendly and if they have the time, are responsive. And I have a couple of ideas about how you can increase the response rate. And so, being relatively brief should go without saying. I think we all appreciate a more brief and to the point message is useful in a cold email. Next, I usually like to tell people something specific about why I'm aware of their work or that I admire their work or I think it's really good or useful or interesting. And that's simply, I saw your article on XYZ and I really thought that was insightful, something like that. And then bring yourself into the equation. You can say, and this is my work and this is what I do. And I think maybe our interests overlap on these couple of things. And then lastly, something really important to share, if it's relevant, is if you have a specific reason for reaching out. So if there's a grant round opening, so let's say ADRIA is opening up and you're keen to find a partner for ADRIA, then good to mention that because then they can look at that opportunity, read about it themselves. But you shouldn't be limited by having that sort of reason to reach out. I actually am a strong believer also in just connecting with people who you think you might have mutual interests with, because sometimes if you just reach out and have a great conversation, you might both start looking for opportunities to collaborate. So very useful, I think. All right, time for the next reflection. This one, I'd like you to just reflect individually. And I'd love for you to just write down a few notes over the next minute or two about first, do you have any existing relationships with researchers that you might want to be building a partnership on in the near future? If you don't have relationships with researchers, or if you want to build your network, what strategies might work for you? Would it be LinkedIn? Would it be conferences? What is sort of appropriate to your personality or your organizational personality? And then lastly, what characteristics might you find most important given what you're interested in? So just, yeah, have a moment to jot those things down, and then we'll move on to the next section. All right, and I'll start moving on. Simply, this is my Midwestern North Americanness coming in, is that I try to fill silence if at all possible. So let's see here. So this is really the core of what I was keen to talk about today in this webinar. So thanks, James, for giving me the opportunity to chat to you all about these sorts of things. Because I think, yeah, just knowing some things to consider when developing a partnership with a university-based researcher can really help smooth out the process of building the relationship and make it a really fruitful one. And I think the metaphor that I often think about in terms of this is kind of knowing what types of baggage, I might bring to a relationship and another person might bring to a relationship, and just having that known up front, so if we're both self-aware of those things that we're bringing to the relationship, we're better able to just account for them and build a fruitful relationship based on those things. So this is quite a list, but I think they're all really pertinent to the types of things that you'll be working on. And so the first thing to say is that timeframes can be a little different for some academics. So sometimes things work a little slower, processes can take a little longer. For instance, ethics applications can really vary even across institutions. So some places are really quite quick, others are not so quick. And I imagine, especially if you're planning on doing some primary research with people who are dealing with substance use matters, I imagine you'll get a thorough consideration from the ethics committee. And so definitely consider that academics sometimes take a little more time to do things. That said, there are some of us, like my team, who are pretty responsive and work almost more like consultancies. So you might be surprised at how quick some corners of the university can be these days. The next thing to take seriously is that university overheads can sometimes be a bit high when compared to NGOs. And so just don't be surprised by what we charge, and know that we don't actually set that number. So if you ask me to make a budget for myself, that I'm not picking that number necessarily. And if you think about it, just to provide context, you think about a big university like mine, Monash, there are people like me who are social scientists who basically need a computer to do my job, and that's about it. But then there's other people on campus who are using a gigantic telescope or a particle accelerator or something that's not so cheap to run. And some of those things are built into the broad overheads of universities. So that's part of the reason that is the way that it is. Third, contracts can sometimes be a bit complicated. So especially bigger universities have pretty developed and strong contracts procedures, and can get the lawyers involved sometimes, in particular around intellectual property matters. And so just being aware that you're going to need to invest a little bit of time in developing a contract is important. And then also thinking about how what you know about your own organization systems and processes in negotiating contracts are. Because if you come ready for reviewing a particular contract, it can really speed up the process. Also, something really important to consider is that university partners will really have a varying degree of knowledge or experience about what your work is about on a day-to-day basis. And so some colleagues might know a lot about what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis, but others you'll really have to spend some time unpacking how you do your work. And similarly, they might need to unpack what they do with their time. And I think it's really important to develop those shared understandings, especially if they're doing research that directly relates to something operational that you're doing. Let's see here. Another really important thing is, I guess academics sometimes use a different language. And I think there's two parts to this conversation. Part of it is jargon. So sometimes it's just academics use a particular group of jargon to talk about the same thing that you talk about using your own jargon, and you might have your set of acronyms that you use on a daily basis and they use a different set of acronyms. And so being willing to just say, oh, I don't know that acronym, and just ask those questions is important. And then I guess I'll also apologize for, I sometimes use very long sentences or problematically large words. And I try to avoid that, but we sometimes can do that as well. So be ready for that occasionally. On that note, I actually think that dovetails into the next point very well, which is I think it's important from your perspective to really come to the relationship knowing that your lived experience and your applied work has real value for this partnership, and that that there's just as much, if not more, value in what you do as there is for a researcher's work, and that partnerships should be built on this mutual respect and mutual affirmation for different roles within a wide group of activities to address a social issue of some kind or another. Another thing to consider is that some academics are really time poor, and so if they don't respond to your request or they just can't collaborate, it might simply be that they just don't have the time, and it's really a genuine thing and it's not an excuse. That's somewhat frequently the case. And so hopefully they communicate well about it though, and they just talk clearly about it. This is a more detailed one, but some university researchers might be really highly specialized, and so they might be really confident in talking for days about one little corner of your project, but then might not feel confident to speculate or comment on other parts of your project because they don't know the evidence that well. And so that's something common sometimes in certain academic areas where the level of confidence or evidence that people might need to say take a position on an issue might be quite high for an academic, whereas for people in applied settings, sometimes the level of evidence practically is a little lower. A couple last things to say. Up front, I think it's really worth clarifying if and how your research might be used in evaluating programs, because sometimes researchers, as well as evaluators, think about research and evaluation as functionally different, which I won't get into that discussion, but some people really may see a very clear line between, oh, this is an evaluation activity. You want me to test whether or not that particular intervention works for this target population. And that's really an evaluative kind of function. Or if they want you, or if you want to do something more foundational, explore the nature of a complex problem. But to use a new substance in the community example again, this new substance has just hit the community and we don't know how it affects a certain population, and we want to think about, just what's happening in the first place, and then theorize what we might do about it. So those things might be distinct, and it might be worth thinking about what you really want in that relationship early on. Two other things from an organizational readiness standpoint to be aware of are whether or not you think you'll use your findings for advocacy purposes, because some academics, like I was saying earlier, have different degrees of how much confidence they need in their findings before they feel confident to take an advocacy or political position on an issue. So knowing whether or not you think there's an advocacy component to what you're doing up front can really help you sort of clarify that without having friction later in the relationship. And then this is a hard one for some organizations. And having worked as an evaluator a few times, it's really important to consider, which is you may want to think about whether or not your organization is ready to hear negative findings if you're going to do some sort of evaluation function. Because oftentimes organizations say confidently, oh, I really want to know if this works. But then when they find out, oh no, it's really not working, that it becomes a trickier thing to communicate. And so having a sense of your risk appetite and your willingness to take in that negative feedback can also just help you frame up how you structure the relationship. And alongside all those things, just finding the right power balance. So to the best of your ability, just negotiating, if one organization has to be the lead on the grant, they're the ones who are actually getting the money and the other one's a subby, just understanding how that affects your power relationship and making sure that everything's nice and clear up front about that. And so the last thing to say in this area, I guess, is that when thinking about all that baggage, if you will, I think it's really useful to take a strengths-based approach towards those things and realize that any of these considerations from universities' perspectives or from NGO perspectives, there's benefits and there's downsides, right? So slow processes can often also mean really high quality and rigor. So you're trading a little time for really confident, really strong findings. Or complex contracts mean that you actually had to get into all the detail up front. So that means that everybody knows their roles and responsibilities, and everybody is really clear on who's doing what and how and why and when. Or explaining your work gives you a chance to actually think about your work. I don't know about you, but when I was working in the social sector, I found that I had very little time sometimes to even just reflect on what I'm doing. So it's an opportunity. So another group reflection. I'd love for you to jump into the Q&A section again. And I'm keen to hear what you think about what you think a university researcher would want to know about you and your organization. So a little like this list that I just presented from the university perspective. What should a university researcher know about you and your organization that might just help have all that baggage up front? Oh yeah, that's a great point. So somebody shared that they have their organization has direct capacity to change about programs and that they're researching and evaluating. Right. So you wouldn't be starting from scratch, and in fact, you're likely a really capable organization already from a research and evaluation perspective, and you might just be looking to partner to supplement your content knowledge or your skill set. But in fact, you could do it on your own if you needed to. Yeah, and also that responsiveness is really important, because I think sometimes as an academic we're further away from actually being able to change a program that then directly affects individual people. And so knowing that you can change your programs and respond to what you're learning is really valuable.
I can't use the Q&A function, so I'm breaking my own rule in using the chat function to say other things. But yeah, I'm the research lead at VADA, and so whenever we're partnering, and I just had a meeting the other week about this, and I had to really be clear that we were looking for, or what our goals were in partnering, were to for the data to be able to use for VADA's advocacy. And they can't necessarily guarantee that, because they don't know what they're going to find, and there's all that. But yeah, understanding that we'd be wanting to use that to further our advocacy and reform aims, I think was really important for them to know.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, and academics are often really open to that conversation, right? Because there's a wide range of viewpoints. Some people, see their dispassionate neutrality as exactly what they contribute, but other people are quite comfortable with advocacy and are quite outspoken. So just finding the right partner for your situation is good, I think. All right. Well, I won't belabor this point, but it's worth reflecting on those things for yourselves to build up your partnerships in the way that you'd like them. So, we have one other one actually. Other key functions: the environment we work in, our organizational structure, and the constraints. Yeah. So I was hoping somebody would mention this. Is that organizations can sometimes be really time poor. They might have limited staff time to engage in a research partnership. It might be a really challenging funding context. I don't know, how your sector is currently faring with government grants or things like that, but university sector, things change all the time. And so, being able to share the unique constraints on your work and how it might affect that relationship, really valuable. Great. Oh yeah, and actually, you did say something otherwise that I think is really important, which is being realistic about what you can do based on those constraints. It's great. All right, so these are really kind of go without saying useful partnership principles and practices, but I think they're worth saying, once a week, every week kind of things. First is at the center of most good partnerships that I've been a part of. We've been able to articulate and capitalize on our shared purpose. And so I imagine in many of the partnerships that you might build, this is about using both of your unique strengths or all of your unique strengths to better serve a particular population here in Victoria. And maybe also contribute to global knowledge as well. But at the end of the day, there's probably a focus on, we really want to help this group dealing with this issue. And keeping that shared purpose or the potential beneficiaries at the front of your mind can really help smooth out a lot of other little details that might get in the way of a happy partnership. So always having that shared purpose in mind really helps, in my opinion. To the point about time constraints, I think the investment of time really often shows commitment. And so if people know, if both sides are really time constrained, but they always make a half hour for this relationship once a week, that really shows a lot, even if it's not a lot of time, that people respect that time or create the time to get done what needs doing, is usually a really great way to show that you're committed to a partnership. Mutual respect really should go without saying, but to that point, I think, if you get an academic partner who seems a bit aloof or doesn't really get what you do and isn't, really deeply interested and engaged in how your day-to-day work works, then you might want to think about whether or not that's the right partner for you or not. So mutual respect is definitely an important thing. As I was saying earlier, clarifications up front about finances, timelines, who brings what skills to the situation. Oftentimes, it's important to sort of map the skills across the team because a lot of people have hidden skill sets that they might not put in their CV right away or mention first thing. Clarifying roles and responsibilities, and if and when appropriate, put it in writing. Usually earlier the better, even if it's just a memorandum of understanding or just here's a half page of what we're thinking we want to do and how we would work. That's really helpful. To this point about advocacy and other outputs, having discussions up front about what outputs or outcomes you really want from the work is important because many academics, are driven by publications, which take sometimes 2-3 years to get out. And most of the time, I imagine your work, you'd want to be sharing your findings first with the people who participated in the research as soon as the research is done, but also to use for advocacy purposes or as a policy brief. And so just making sure that you've really structured in and budgeted in all the outputs that you think you need to meet everybody's needs is important. Senior level organizational support is critical in my opinion, not only because it helps you get approved to build the partnership or apply for the grant, but also because those people often have additional ideas or insight into the context or relationships that can help supplement and support your new relationship that you're building. And so, yeah, engaging those folks early is usually good. And then related to all these things is just that active, open communication. So when in doubt, just clarify with your new partner. And this means even really little things like talking about how you like to communicate, when you like to communicate, should you identify a key contact in each organization, what platforms do you use? I find with a lot of our government partners, they're all Teams based, but we tend to use Zoom. And so we meet them on Teams, just that kind of like really basic stuff. But, knowing how you can best collaborate can really get things moving. All right, so the last group reflection for this webinar is, in your experience, what are some of the important principles for building partnerships? Not already mentioned. So are there any things that I've missed in that list that you think, in your experience, have really been helpful in making sure that it's a happy partnership in the first place? And I'll just mention as well, some of these things might be values aligned, so it might be organizational values. Oh yeah, so we've got troubleshooting, how we'll manage things when they go wrong. So that's a really good thing to, negotiate up front. What happens, who do you talk to? How do you deal with it? Continually seeking feedback. I think that's a great practice. And actually, although I'm not a full agile practitioner, I don't know if anybody's familiar with agile approaches to project management, but there's lots of project management strategies that have moments of reflection or retrospective discussions built into the project cycle. And so checking in regularly to seek feedback from each other and discuss what's working, what's not, what should we stop doing, what should we start doing. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be a 20-minute conversation, but it can really help. Passion for the client group and dedication to improving their lives. Yeah, I think that's that shared purpose thing, right? So, I think very frequently NGO and research partnerships are really brought to life by different people using different skill sets for that same purpose of how do we benefit people, either through really high quality knowledge or through programs that actually touch their lives directly. And then let's see here. Engage in self or team reflection post-partnership can really help to inform and improve partnerships. Yeah, that's right. So that's a really useful one, I think, because if you're thinking about whether or not to build a partnership right now, it might be worth having a moment over coffee to think about what's worked in past partnerships or what hasn't worked and what you think you want in the future partnership. And so you could do that now. And then you could also try and build that into whatever grant you apply for, right? So if you're applying for the ADRIA grant with a research partner, you could make sure to build in some retrospective time in your project plan to think about things, how they're working. And I'd encourage that to happen as a part of monitoring and evaluation as well, just to say, if depending on your monitoring and evaluation approach, building in some reflective time, midpoint in certain programs or quarterly or whatever the cycle requires is really valuable. That's great. So really helpful. Let's see here. So the last thing I wanted to just mention was a little bit of inspiration for a couple of different models of partnership that you could think about. And this is just borrowed from an article from 2016. There's lots of other ways that you can think about models of NGO and research partnership, but this is one that's in a peer-reviewed journal article that talks about the types of partnerships that you might be building. And so the 5 that I wanted to highlight, the first one is expert consultant, which is really bringing in an academic expert to just come in and do an evaluation is the way that I would describe it. And so if you have a program that you're thinking about developing or running and you want to test whether or not it worked and you want sort of a neutral evaluator to come in, that's sort of the expert consultant model. And it's a really valuable model to have somebody from the outside come in and just say, that thing worked or that thing didn't work, especially if it's a person who's an expert in that field. The next one is called expert trainer, which is similar to the expert consultant in that it's kind of bringing in the researcher to provide that expert knowledge on a thing. But then it also involves some knowledge sharing, right? So it would be explicitly involving the researcher to also maybe build some research skills or some evaluation skills in members of your team that might not yet have them. And so the thing that I would mention there is that building that in upfront and not assuming that, say, the expert consultant model has that already built in, and making sure that the researcher knows that that's explicitly part of their role is an important thing to communicate upfront. The next one is joint learning. And this is really more of a co-designed approach. So it's the researcher and the organization and possibly stakeholders, people who are directly affected by what you might be doing, all working together to build a research agenda. And this is usually centered more around processes that are continuous learning processes. So not necessarily just an evaluation of one thing, but how are we building these sort of ongoing learning practices about something? And I guess the thing to say about this otherwise is that this model really is framed around building that partnership more so than any specific part of the research, though the research is important. And so a joint learning model is really useful if you think you want to build a partnership that you could use as a platform for any number of activities, not just one discrete research project, but as opening a door to a range of new opportunities. Best practice is also similar to the expert consultant model, but I guess the way to describe this is that it's bringing in somebody external to do some big picture thinking with you. So instead of doing a specific evaluation, it might be about large scale, how do you manage this program? Or how should we be thinking about the long-term impacts of what we've been doing, even though we haven't yet been measuring it, that kind of thing. So it's this big picture thinking is another way that is a really useful way to engage university-based researchers. And then lastly, even though it sounds a little intimidating in its name, I think, theory development, I think it's actually a really useful one and one that you might actually want to be doing, which is if there's a new problem or an issue in your community and you want to understand the issue as well as theorize some mechanisms by which it's working, so, again, that new substance in the community affecting a particular population question that I was mentioning. If you need to get your head around a problem and you need to put forward an idea of how that problem is actually functioning in the community, that theory development function is actually really valuable. And I'll just note on that one that a lot of researchers, I think, would be really interested in those sorts of opportunities because it also frequently contributes to emerging knowledge globally. So if I say that fentanyl example, again, I don't know how affected Australia is, but learning from Canada and the US and cross-learning between Canada and the US has been vital in that process, I know, in North America, for instance. Just some ideas. Those aren't the only models you can use, but those are some ones that appear in the academic literature. And so we're at the moment where I wrap things up. And I think if you left this webinar with just these 4 messages, I'd be really happy. The first one is it's really useful to understand your motivations for partnering. So just understanding why you want to do it in the first place should really drive some of what you're doing. The next thing is don't be shy, reach out to people. They're very friendly. People are very kind usually. Third, trying to reflect on researchers' cultures as you understand them, as well as your own organizational cultures, and then trying to come to the relationship and consider those things and bear those things in mind as you build a relationship is really valuable. And then lastly, just communication. When in doubt, ask, clarify, and just be upfront about how you're going to structure that relationship. And so, we've got a question and answer question. So I'll just jump to the next slide. I'll say thank you, and I'll say, now's the time I'd love to discuss any questions or comments you have. So we've got one already. It says, what if you want to work with a researcher to develop a sustainable service model through the improvement of existing models that may need to be updated. Where would that sit within the 5 partnership models? So let's have a look. So if you're refining a model, I think that could probably fit into best practice would be one, or expert consultant, depending on the degree of engagement you want from the researcher in terms of like strategic conversations. Yeah, but it depends a little bit on how you do it, because it could also be a joint learning initiative, especially if you wanted to do it very collaboratively. So if you wanted to be, as an organization, very deeply engaged in that process and also involve service users, which might be very advisable. I don't think you'd be limited to just one model. It would probably be dictated primarily by how much time you have to invest in the project, as well as how much you want that researcher to be sort of a collaborative partner, or if you want them to be that outside expert who comes and gives that strategic insight. I hope that helps. Yeah, other comments or questions? Really appreciate. Oh yeah.
Oh, sorry, Paul. I was just going to say, while people are writing their comments and questions, I just thought I'd jump in with a couple of things that, a couple of reflections I have from your presentation that'll hopefully be helpful to attendees. One is that, so you mentioned ethics, and that ethics can be a really, can be a lengthy and complex process. So one thing I wanted to note is that you don't need ethics. You don't need your ethics finalized in order to apply for an ADRIA grant. If your project needs ethics, that can be, something that happens down the line. So yeah, you don't need to do all the I think in the last round there was a bit of confusion about that, where people thought they needed their ethics done before they got the grant, and that's not the case. You also mentioned evaluation, and evaluation projects are absolutely eligible for ADRIA grants, but not routine evaluation. So not a program that gets evaluated every year anyway. We're not going to fund that to be done, and we're not going to fund like a financial audit of a program or something like that. But yeah, a kind of from the ground up evaluation, or a new evaluation, even if the program's existing. But yeah, the evaluation of a program that hasn't been evaluated before is definitely eligible. And just a note on the contract stuff, and you talked about open communication, and I think university contracts can be really complex and full of legalese, which is boring. But in my experience, it can be really helpful to have a conversation about that with the researcher. And so just say, so you're going to write us a report. Does that belong to you, or does that belong to us? What's the copyright? Are we licensed to distribute that? Who owns the data? You can, it'll all be in the contract, but it can be really helpful to just to talk it out as well with the academic.
Yeah, and I'll add to that also, getting your key admin people in the same room. So if you have your academic and the project person from the NGO, and then you both get the people who actually understand the contracts in the room as well, that's usually the model I tend to use. So, yeah, because I am not a lawyer. Well, yeah, I'm happy to take questions after the fact as well. If there's anything you want to discuss, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll do my best to be responsive.
Yeah, and definitely, if you want, Paul's going to be presenting our other webinars for ADRIA as well. So if you've got areas that you want covered, or if you had questions that you wanted to send to me for Paul to address in future webinars, that's also fine as well.
Yeah, well, thank you again for the opportunity. Really happy to chat about this issue today.
No worries. Thanks, Paul. And everyone, just keep an eye out for the program guidelines. I will send an email to let you know when they're up on the website. I'm also just going to write my email in the chat. And if you'd like to be added to the ADRIA mailing list, please just send me an email and I can pop you on that. The program guidelines, the website are all going to be updated and out this week. It's just we've got a little had a little delay on it with some of our IT stuff. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks, Paul. We'll see you next time.
See you soon. Bye.